Hello. So this video is going to focus on the history of the Theosophical Society in the modern era. In 1917, it was a year of great significance because that was the first time we saw a communist party take control over an entire nation. And the name of that revolution was called the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. So I'm not going to go into the deep history of the Bolshevik Revolution, as it was, broken up into two parts, as Russia did have a short-lived democracy with a provisional government. But very quickly, the Bolsheviks wanted all power for themselves. And so step by step, the Bolsheviks kicked out other political contenders and other political parties, including the Mensheviks, the Socialist Revolutionaries, and of course, the royals, anyone connected to the monarchy in affiliation with the White Army, as it was called. So at the time, Russian society was very much interested in esoteric practices from all sectors of society. From everyday people to the aristocracy, Russia has a deep connection to spiritualistic practices. In this embrace of spiritualism, there was a deep passion and love and sense of community that was centered around the divine and Jesus Christ. So there's different groups that were part of Russian history and esoteric practices, and Rasputin is someone who came from this sort of grassroots, mystical Christianity that engaged in practices like trances, prayer, meditation, in order to invoke an enlightened state of surreal, cosmic, and divine conception. So this was a power that was appreciated for all its ineffable energy. So Russia has always been a land of mystical religions and a very mystical place, as Russia is very ancient, in the sense that when we look at Native American culture in the North Americans, we have to remember that the Bering Strait landmass is something that crosses from Russia into Alaska. So, like Manchu people who live on the eastern end of the Asian landmass, they have DNA that is a precursor for the DNA of North Americans, natives. So this is an idea of an ancient shamanistic religion. And the word shaman is a Siberian word, because shamanism is the most ancient form of religion, because it was when an elder, someone with gifts of having a connection, again, that passionate, mystical, yet ineffable cosmic embrace, is something that we still see in leaders today of religious community and religious organizations, whether it's a priest or a bishop or a pope or a rabbi or an oman. All of these people are capable of evoking religious spiritual energy that creates a sense that a divine presence is here. So we are seeing the importance of faith even today, as President Trump created a Department of Faith to reinvigorate and to restore a sense of spiritual fervor and spiritual enlightenment and spiritual engagement. And that is through a practice of public prayer, of gathering around and evoking a special energy, because that's what prayer is. Prayer is a special energy. it's a way to communicate with the divine directly, because prayer is a way to access God's ears. So, going back to 1917, I'm going to now go into the discussion of the persecution of Theosophical societies by communist regimes. I'm going to start reading from some of my notes here. So, we have to delineate that communism was a popular ideology at the time because capitalism was the dominant economic structure. So we lived now in capitalist society, but back then it was also a more rugged capitalism where there wasn't as many safety nets, and it was the responsibility of the church and charitable organizations to come to the rescue of the poor. So that wasn't always enough, though, because there were abuses of workers, and there were low-paying wages, and there was child labor. So it was a picture of people overworking and unsafe working conditions all across the world at that time, because labor rights were not guaranteed yet. So this is how socialist parties attained power and drew popularity. And of course, workers were supporters of these, but ever so often those of the aristocracy and the upper classes, those were called the intelligentsia, and they supported the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of a communist society. So these were revolutionaries, people who wanted radical and drastic change. At the same time, the Theosophical Society had a different vision. In many ways, the history of the 20th century is the Theosophists versus the communists, because it was a battle between them. At the time of the Russian Revolution, again, Russian society was immersed in a deep spiritualism. There was Martinist lodges, Masonic lodges, Theosophical halls all throughout Russia. So these were different esoteric groups that drew from ancient occult religious studies. So Martinist lodges is supplements to Christianity and more advanced prayers and more access to different knowledge. Masonry is another example of that, with roots towards European Masonry and the construction of Christian churches in the medieval era, and the extension to the notion of an obligation to uplift and to be free, because the notions of Freemasonry is tied to the construction of democratic republics. It's important to note that during the short-lived democracy of Russia under the Duma and the provisional government, Kerensky was a Freemason. So Freemasonry and Theosophy, important to note, in many ways were aligned, because Theosophy popularized Freemasonry and brought women into Freemasonry more and more with the establishment of co-Masonry, which was something that Annie Besant was a strong proponent of. So going back to the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet government under Vladimir Lenin and later Joseph Stalin implemented harsh policies to suppress theosophical spiritual movements. The Theosophical Society came under immense scrutiny for its spiritual nature, which they found was at odds with scientific socialism. In the early days of the revolution, theosophical groups were targeted alongside religious and philosophical organizations that they considered counter-revolutionary or subversive to Marxist-Leninist thought. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Soviet government banned many spiritual organizations, including Theosophy. Theosophists were persecuted for promoting ideas that were seen as anti-communist and anti-socialist. The society's activities were suppressed, and its members were forced to operate underground. Many were imprisoned, and some were executed in the broader crackdowns on counter-revolutionary elements. By the 1930s, Theosophy was largely driven underground in the Soviet Union, with many key figures having fled the country or going into hiding. So this is when it's very important to bring in Harbin, because those who fled the Bolsheviks, they took safety in Harbin, in the east, and a rat line was established from Harbin to Munich. So by 1918, Thule was there to be an embrace from those who fled Harbin to Munich. Important to note that even the Tsar himself had a special prayer room, believed was also in Harbin, but I don't have final verification on that. But I do know from my notes before that he had a special prayer room where the swastika insignia was used on certain esoteric documents. So it's really important to note that such a thing as the swastika was also appropriated by the Theosophical Society. And so this is a relevant source of information. Nazi Germany, of course, the Theosophists were in many ways initial supporters of Hitler. Unfortunate. But Nazi ideology developed from Ariosophy, which developed from Theosophy. So in many ways, the early days of fascism were the early days of the anti-communist theosophical movement. And this does pertain to Mussolini, because Mussolini did write for the Herald of the Star of the East twice. And Mussolini also knew Maria Montessori, a woman of significant influence, a prominent doctor and educator, who now has maybe hundreds of schools in her name all over the world. Important to note that Mussolini was from the worker socialist movement, in the sense that he was a writer and he sent many articles to even atheistic journals. So when he met Maria Montessori, I believe in 1911, that was a redefining moment for Mussolini. And that is when you begin to see him being less and less of a socialist and more of a prim and proper fascist. So, did Maria Montessori teach fascism to Mussolini? The same question must be asked, did Dora Kunze and Kathy Katrina Bierbaumer teach Nazism to Hitler? It's very important to note that there are no photos and no succinct biographies of Dora Kunze and Kathy Katrina Bierbaumer, because those two identities have not been fully identified today. And what still remains is that Kathy Katrina Bierbaumer did disappear from history, and there was an unknown escort who was there to pick her up from the Isle of Man. Important to note that Maria Montessori and Mario, her son, they were both subject to intern and Maria had it more softer than Mario, and Maria was forced to take confinement to the Theosophical Society of Adyar, India. And that after the war, Maria Montessori was able to repair her image and to distance herself from Mussolini. So this is history that I didn't learn in my studies of fascism course. But it's important to note that on day one of that university course, our professor said, none of us know how fascism developed. Because it's open to interpretation, and it is a mysterious thing, but the reason why it's open to interpretation is because fascism developed from the secret society world. Fascism developed as a radical, anti-communist defense. And then they went in on the offense, and then they became responsible for all those human rights abuses. And that's when the United States had to step in and say, stop this. So I'm going to end the talk there and say that fascism is very dangerous. It is anti-American. It is anti-patriotic. It is anti-human rights. Because if you support a fascist regime, it's only a matter of time that it eats you up too. And that's the story and the tragedy of the Theosophical Society. Because they were anti-communists and pro-fascists, but eventually the Theosophical Society was persecuted by fascism, both in Germany and Italy. So it's a story of people giving power to the tyrants that will ultimately be their own demise.